December 18th, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Feldwebel Klaus Hartmann's breath crystallized in the frigid morning air as he crept through the abandoned American position. Pine needles crunched beneath his boots, each step careful and deliberate. The Americans had a reputation for booby traps. His stomach had been gnawing at itself for 3 days now, subsisting on nothing but the sawdust-laden Kommissbrot and ersatz coffee that tasted of roasted acorns. The Great German Offensive, what the Americans would later call the Battle of the Bulge, had pushed forward so rapidly that their already strained supply lines had snapped like frozen telephone wires. The foxhole appeared hastily abandoned. Shell casings littered the frozen earth, and a half-burned letter fluttered against a tree root, someone's Christmas wishes that would never reach home. But it was the olive-drab boxes scattered across the position that made Hartmann's pulse quicken. K-rations. He'd heard rumors about American field rations from prisoners, stories that seemed too absurd to credit. Now, kneeling in the snow-dusted depression where an American GI had spent his last hours before retreating, Hartmann pulled one of the waxed cartons toward him with trembling fingers. The box tore open to reveal impossible wealth. A tin of chopped ham and eggs, another of processed cheese, crackers that weren't made from turnips or sawdust. A packet of instant coffee, real coffee, not the bitter substitute Germans had endured for 2 years. 4 cigarettes, toilet paper, matches, chewing gum, and at the bottom, wrapped in brown paper like a gift from another universe, a bar of Hershey's chocolate. Hartmann stared at the contents spread across his lap, his mind struggling to process what his eyes reported. This was one man's meal, one meal for one American soldier, and it contained more genuine food than his entire squad had seen in a week. His hands shook as he opened the chocolate, breaking off a small piece and placing it on his tongue. The sweetness exploded across his palate. Not the grainy vegetable fat substitute the Reich produced, but real cocoa, real sugar, an impossibility made manifest. Behind him, Gefreiter Müller emerged from checking another foxhole, his arms laden with more K-ration boxes. "Mein Gott, Klaus?" he whispered, his voice catching. The 2 German soldiers, veterans of the Eastern Front where men had killed each other over a frozen potato, stood in the midst of casual American abundance. Around them, scattered like autumn leaves, lay the detritus of a supply system so vast, so overwhelming in its plenty, that frontline troops could afford to abandon what would have been treasures in the Wehrmacht. Half-eaten rations, unopened boxes, cigarette packs with 3 or 4 smokes remaining, tossed aside like spent brass. Hartmann picked up a discarded can, its contents partially consumed. The American had eaten perhaps half the ham, then thrown away meat. In December 1944, when German civilians were mixing sawdust into their bread and making soup from grass, an American soldier had thrown away meat because he'd had enough. How? Müller asked, though the question encompassed more than just the food. How could any nation produce such abundance? How could they transport it across an ocean, through France, into Belgium, and still have so much that soldiers treated it as disposable? How could Germany, with all its supposed superiority, its efficiency, its will, compete against an enemy who fed its common soldiers better than German officers ate? The question hung in the frozen air, unanswered and unanswerable. Word spread through Hartmann's unit like fire through dry timber. Within an hour, every man who could slip away from his post had done so, scavenging through the American positions with the desperate efficiency of winter wolves. They found more than food. They found a revelation that struck deeper than any propaganda broadcast could have prepared them for. The Americans hadn't just retreated in good order, they'd retreated without concern for leaving supplies behind. Why should they worry? More would come, always more. While German quartermasters counted every bullet, weighed every gram of black bread, and diluted soup until it was little more than hot water with the memory of vegetables, the Americans operated from a premise of infinite plenty. Unterscharführer Berg, an SS man attached to their unit, tried to maintain ideological discipline. Decadent excess, he declared, even as chocolate smeared the corner of his mouth. This softness is why they'll lose. A soldier needs only will and courage, not luxury. But the men weren't listening. They were eating, smoking American cigarettes, reading the labels on things they'd forgotten existed. Instant lemon powder for flavoring water, malted milk tablets, fruit bars. Each item, a small miracle, A message from a world where factories still functioned, where farms still produced, where the home front meant something more than bombed cities and starving civilians. Hartman found himself studying the packaging as much as consuming the contents. Everything was mass-produced, standardized, sealed against moisture and time. The industrial might required to create millions of these boxes, to fill them with this variety, to ship them across the world. It was a war effort that rendered their own desperate improvisations childish by comparison. Germany was fighting with whatever it could scrape together. America was fighting with whatever it felt like bringing. As dawn broke fully across the Ardennes, revealing the full extent of the abandoned American supplies, Hartman understood something that no amount of National Socialist fervor could deny. This wasn't just about food. It was about capacity, potential, and the kind of total war Germany had claimed to pioneer, but which America had actually achieved. The chocolate was still melting on his tongue when the realization hit him with the force of an artillery shell. We've already lost this war. The revelation spread through the German lines like a virus of doubt. By noon, on December 18th, as the Ardennes offensive pressed forward, hundreds of German soldiers had tasted American plenty. Each abandoned position told the same story. Each captured supply dump confirmed the impossible mathematics of American production. What started as Hartman's private epiphany became a collective understanding that would eat away at Wehrmacht morale more effectively than any propaganda leaflet. 20 kilometers south, Oberleutnant Friedrich Zimmermann of the 2nd Panzer Division stood in a captured American supply depot near Nouville, trying to make sense of what his men had discovered. The warehouse, hastily evacuated just hours before, contained enough food to feed a battalion for a month. Not emergency rations, not the bare minimum for survival, but food with variety, nutrition, comfort. Herr Oberleutnant, his sergeant reported, voice thick with disbelief. We've counted over 3,000 K-ration boxes, but that's not. He paused, struggling to find words. He led Zimmermann to another section of the depot, cases of Coca-Cola, hundreds of them. The German officer stared at the red and white logos, his mind refusing to process the logic. The Americans had shipped carbonated beverages across the Atlantic. They had allocated precious shipping space, fuel, and logistics to bring their soldiers a sweet drink. While German forces measured fuel in liters, counting every drop needed to keep their tigers and panthers moving, the Americans burned fuel to transport what could only be described as luxuries. There's more, sir, the sergeant continued, leading him deeper into the warehouse. Candy bars by the thousands, not just chocolate but varieties Zimmermann had never seen. Baby Ruth, Milky Way, lifesavers, chewing gum in flavors that seemed impossible, spearmint, juicy fruit, cinnamon, cigarettes by the carton, Lucky Strikes, Camels, Chesterfields, each pack containing 20 perfect white cylinders, not the harsh Macorca tobacco mixed with dried leaves that German soldiers on the Eastern Front had learned to smoke. Zimmermann picked up a can labelled Vienna sausages and read the ingredients: beef, pork, chicken, salt, spices. Real meat, mechanically separated and processed, sealed in metal that itself spoke of industrial abundance, steel used for food storage while Germany melted down church bells for ammunition. His radio man, a young Gefreiter named Fischer who still believed in final victory, tried to rationalize what they were seeing. They're weak, Herr Oberleutnant, dependent on these comforts. Our men are stronger because they've learned to fight without. Without food? Zimmermann interrupted, his voice sharp. Without proper supplies? Tell me, Fischer, when was the last time you ate meat that wasn't horse meat from our own dead transport animals? The boy fell silent. Around them, German soldiers filled their pockets, their bread bags, their ammunition pouches with American food. They ate with the mechanical determination of men who didn't know when they'd see such plenty again. Some wept as they tasted peanut butter for the first time in their lives. Others laughed with a hysteria that bordered on madness, smoking American cigarettes down to their fingers, as if trying to absorb every molecule of this impossible abundance. Zimmermann found a stack of letters near an overturned desk, mail that American soldiers hadn't had time to collect. He knew English well enough to read them. Mothers writing about Thanksgiving dinners. Wives, describing trips to grocery stores where shelves groaned with plenty. Children talking about baseball games and movie theaters. An entire nation functioning not just normally but prosperously while fighting a global war on two fronts. One letter, from a mother in Iowa to her son in the 106th Infantry Division, contained a gentle complaint. "I wanted to send you more cookies, but the rationing of sugar means I could only bake 2 dozen instead of 4. Zimmerman stared at the words. American civilians were baking cookies to send overseas. They were experiencing hardship that meant reducing cookie shipments from 4 dozen to 2. Meanwhile, his own mother's letters spoke of waiting in line for 6 hours for a 1/4 kilogram of potatoes, of making coffee from ground chicory root, of children in Berlin eating rats. The mathematical reality was inescapable. If America could produce and transport all of this, if this represented what they were willing to abandon without a second thought, then what was their true capacity? What percentage of their actual strength had Germany even faced? He thought of the briefings he'd attended, the confident assertions of German technical superiority. Yes, the Tiger tank was a masterpiece of engineering, nearly invincible in single combat. But the Americans didn't fight single combats. They fought with mathematics. For every Tiger, they could produce 20 Shermans. For every German soldier subsisting on Kommissbrot and ersatz coffee, they could field a GI fed on a diet that would have seemed luxurious to German civilians before the war even began. The depot yielded more revelations. Medical supplies that went beyond battlefield necessities, aspirin, vitamins, foot powder, even treatment for trench foot that acknowledged soldiers' comfort as a military priority, recreation materials, playing cards, paperback books, board games. The Americans planned for their soldiers to have leisure time at the front. They shipped entertainment across an ocean, while German soldiers hadn't seen leave in 2 years. Private Hans Müller, barely 18, found a box marked sundries and opened it with the reverence of a man handling religious relics. Inside, razor blades, shaving cream, toothpaste, soap that smelled of lavender, and small packets labelled prophylactic. The Americans were supplying their troops with birth control, anticipating not just survival but life beyond combat, human desires beyond killing and being killed. "Look at this," another soldier called out. He'd found a damaged crate containing fruit cocktail, peaches, pears, grapes, and cherries in sweet syrup. The geometric impossibility of it struck them all simultaneously. These fruits didn't ripen in the same season. They came from different climates, different hemispheres perhaps. Yet here they were, combined in a can, sweetened and preserved, shipped to the middle of Belgium in December to feed common soldiers. Oberleutnant Zimmerman watched his men gorge themselves and knew he should stop them, maintain discipline, prevent the stomach cramps that would surely follow. But what was the point? Let them eat. Let them taste what they were fighting against. Let them understand, through their stomachs, if not their minds, the true nature of the enemy they faced. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow-covered depot, a runner arrived with orders to continue the advance. The men reluctantly formed up, their pockets bulging with contraband calories, their minds heavy with new knowledge. They were still German soldiers, still bound by oath and duty. They would still fight. But something fundamental had changed in those hours among American plenty. Zimmerman found himself thinking of Napoleon's Grande Armée, starving in the Russian snow, defeated as much by logistics as by combat. But this was different. Napoleon's men had starved because supply lines failed across impossible distances. German soldiers were glimpsing starvation despite fighting in the heart of Europe, while their enemies maintained abundance across an ocean. This wasn't a failure of logistics. It was a failure of conception, of understanding what kind of war they had started when they awakened the industrial giant across the Atlantic. The offensive rolled on, but the virus of doubt spread faster than the German spearheads. By December 20th, as the 2nd Panzer Division pushed toward the Meuse River, the stories had percolated up to senior command. In a farmhouse outside Bastogne, General Major Heinrich von Lüttwitz received reports that should have pleased him. His forces were advancing. American units were retreating in disorder. The surprise had been total. Yet the additional intelligence troubled him more than any tactical setback could have. Herr General, his intelligence officer, Major Beckmann, reported with visible discomfort. "We have multiple accounts from across the front. The Americans are abandoning massive quantities of supplies. But it's not panic. They're choosing what to take and what to leave. They're leaving food supplies that our quartermasters estimate would cost the Reich millions of Reichsmarks to produce, if we could produce them at all. Von Lutwitz studied the compiled reports. Every captured American soldier seemed to confirm the same impossible reality. American soldiers complained about them constantly. They were considered monotonous, barely palatable, the worst food in the American military system. GIs would trade multiple K-rations for a single hot meal from a field kitchen, not because they were hungry, but because they were bored. One captured sergeant from the 28th Infantry Division, interrogated at length, had laughed when asked about food supplies. "You want to know about shortages?" he'd said. "Last week we ran low on ice cream. The boys were pretty steamed about that." The interrogator had stared at him, certain something had been lost in translation. Ice cream. At the front. In December. The sergeant had explained, with the casual air of discussing weather, that American field kitchens included ice cream makers, that refrigeration units followed combat troops, that hot turkey dinners had been planned for Christmas, complete with cranberry sauce and pumpkin pie, shipped from America in time for the holiday. The interrogator had terminated the session, convinced the American was lying or delusional, but report after report confirmed similar stories. Meanwhile, in a destroyed Sherman tank near Street Vith, Unteroffizier Walter Kraus made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The tank crew had died instantly when an 88mm shell penetrated the turret, but their personal effects remained scattered in the driver's compartment. Among them, chocolate bars, some half-eaten, packages from home containing cookies, homemade fudge, and pralines, letters discussing Christmas shopping and New Year's plans, and most impossibly, a small can of Planters peanuts, salted and roasted, branded with a monocled peanut wearing a top hat. Kraus sat in the blood-stained driver's seat, eating those peanuts one by one, reading the letters of dead men who wrote about movies they wanted to see when they got home, restaurants they missed, girls they would marry. These weren't the letters of a nation under siege. They were the correspondence of a country so secure in its victory that its primary concern was whether their boys were comfortable enough while they won it. The psychological mathematics were devastating. Kraus had a brother on the Eastern Front who wrote of eating bread made from sawdust and acorns, of units fighting over the corpses of horses, of men dying from starvation even when no enemy was present. His sister in Hamburg described surviving on 800 calories a day, watching her children's eyes grow hollow with hunger. And here sat evidence that American civilians could send luxury snacks overseas, that even in wartime their factories produced branded peanuts with cartoon mascots. 20 kilometers away, at a captured American field hospital, the disparities became even starker. Hauptmann Dr. Ernst Richter, a Wehrmacht medical officer, walked through the abandoned facility in stunned silence. The Americans had evacuated their wounded, but left behind supplies that defied comprehension. Penicillin in quantities that would have supplied every German field hospital on the Western Front. Morphine, without restriction. Surgical equipment that German doctors hadn't seen since 1942. Blood plasma in refrigerated units, typed and ready for transfusion. But it was the non-essential supplies that broke something in Richter's understanding. Vitamins for daily distribution. Psychiatric medications for combat fatigue. The Americans acknowledged battle exhaustion as a treatable condition rather than cowardice. Dental supplies for routine care. The medical depot suggested a military that planned not just for survival, but for the long-term health of its soldiers, their quality of life after the war. They even have this. His assistant held up a bottle of Coca-Cola from a damaged crate, marked for medical use. The sugar content, apparently, helps with shock treatment. Richter laughed, a bitter sound that caught in his throat. The German Medical Corps diluted its morphine to stretch supplies, operated without anesthetic when necessary, and here was evidence that Americans prescribed soft drinks for medical purposes. The luxury that German propaganda mocked as American weakness was actually evidence of surplus so vast that comfort items could be classified as medical supplies. As night fell on December 20th, intercepted American radio communications provided the final, crushing context. Supply officers were calling for emergency resupply, not of ammunition, though fierce fighting continued, but of cigarettes and candy. Units were complaining that their holiday meal supplies might be delayed. One quartermaster, apparently unaware his frequency was compromised, spent 10 minutes arguing about the proper chocolate-to-vanilla ratio for ice cream shipments. In his command post, General Major von Lüttwitz received a priority message from a Luftwaffe reconnaissance unit. American supply convoys were flowing toward the front in unbroken streams, headlights blazing in defiance of German air power that everyone knew no longer existed in meaningful numbers. The Red Ball Express, the legendary American supply operation, was rushing forward, not with desperate ammunition reserves, but with regular resupply, food, winter clothing, mail from home, and yes, those precious cigarettes the GIs demanded. The general stood before his operational map, measuring distances with dividers, calculating fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, casualties. His offensive was succeeding tactically but failing strategically. Every kilometre forward stretched their supply lines thinner, while the Americans simply opened their infinite tap wider. They were defeating tactical brilliance with logistical arithmetic. Major Beckman approached with another report, his face grave. Herr General, we've interrogated more prisoners. They confirm that what we're seeing, these abandoned supplies, represent perhaps 2 days of normal consumption for their units. 2 days. And they express no concern about replacement. Von Lüttwitz set down his dividers. 2 days of American excess could feed his division for a month. He thought of his men, even now advancing through the frozen forest, their stomachs full of American chocolate and processed cheese, their pockets stuffed with cigarettes worth more than Reichsmarks on the black market. They were conquering territory but being conquered by possibility, by the sheer weight of American plenty. Continue the offensive, he ordered, because what else could he say? But both men knew the truth that was spreading through the ranks like gangrene through a wound. They were fighting an enemy who could afford to waste more than Germany could afford to produce. The war's outcome was being written not in tactics or courage, but in calories and cargo ships, in factories that ran 3 shifts and farms that had never felt the touch of war. Outside, German soldiers advanced through the darkness, their steps lighter from American rations, their minds heavier with American implications. By December 22nd, as the German offensive stalled around Bastogne, the psychological erosion had become measurable in military terms. Feldwebel Klaus Hartmann, now 3 days into his encounter with American abundance, watched his squad's behavior change in ways that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. During a halt in their advance, instead of maintaining their weapons or improving positions, his men huddled around a small fire, heating American sea rations they'd been hoarding and discussing flavors like pre-war restaurant critics. The beef stew is better warm, Gefreiter Müller advised a younger soldier, demonstrating how to punch holes in the can for ventilation. But the ham and lima beans, ham and motherfuckers the Americans call them, those are terrible, hot or cold. They had learned American slang from prisoners, adopting not just their food but their casual relationship with it. The very soldiers who had once stood at attention while singing of Germanic superiority now sat in the snow, debating the merits of American processed foods with the expertise of connoisseurs. Hartmann should have stopped them, should have enforced discipline. But he found himself unable to summon the necessary conviction. That morning, he'd written a letter to his wife in Cologne, if Cologne still existed after the bombing, and found himself unable to describe what they'd discovered. How could he explain that the enemy they were fighting gave its common soldiers better food than German officers had seen since 1941? How could he maintain the fiction that victory was possible when American trash heaps contained more nutrition than German supply convoys? The mail that did arrive from home made matters worse. Private Schultz received a letter from his mother describing her Christmas preparations. I managed to find 3 potatoes and a small piece of salt pork for our feast. We'll think of you as we celebrate. Schultz read this while eating from a can of American turkey and noodles, his 3rd meal of the day, each more substantial than his family's Christmas dinner. He crumpled the letter and threw it into the fire, then walked into the forest. When Hartmann found him an hour later, he was sobbing uncontrollably, chocolate wrappers scattered around him like accusations. My little brother thinks I'm a hero, Schultz choked out between sobs. He thinks I'm strong, fighting for Germany. But I'm here eating like a king while he starves. What kind of war is this? What kind of victory could possibly justify this? The question had no answer that wouldn't shatter what remained of their purpose. At Wehrmacht headquarters, intelligence reports confirmed what field commanders already knew but couldn't officially acknowledge. German soldiers were beginning to desert, not to escape danger, but to seek American captivity. They weren't fleeing combat, They were fleeing toward the promise of 3 meals a day, medical care, and the dignity of adequate supplies. Gefreiter Johann Weiss became one of them on December 23rd. He simply walked toward American lines with his hands raised, carrying nothing but a white handkerchief and an empty K-ration box, his passport to plenty. His interrogation report, filed by an American intelligence officer, noted his primary motivation with clinical precision. Subject states he could no longer watch his comrades starve while fighting an enemy who discards better food than German civilians have seen in 3 years. Claims this inequality represents a form of defeat more profound than military loss. Weiss was processed, fed hot food, given medical attention for his frostbite, and issued clean clothes. Within hours of surrender, he had received better treatment than months of Wehrmacht service had provided. He would spend the rest of the war in a POW camp in Kansas, gaining 15 kilograms and writing letters home about abundant meals that his family couldn't believe were true. But for every soldier who surrendered, dozens remained trapped between duty and despair. They fought on, but their hearts were no longer in it. During combat, they would rush American positions not to destroy them, but to capture them intact, hoping for abandoned supplies. Units that should have pressed advantages instead stopped to loot K-rations. The tactical momentum of the Ardennes offensive died not from American bullets, but from American chocolate bars. Unterscharführer Berg, the SS man who had initially dismissed American plenty as decadent weakness, experienced his own transformation on Christmas Eve. His unit had captured an American supply truck that had skidded off an icy road. Inside, they found not ammunition or strategic materials, but Christmas packages from the States, hundreds of them, addressed to soldiers of the 101st Airborne, surrounded in Bastogne. Berg opened package after package with increasing fury that gradually transformed into something else. Homemade cookies in decorated tins, hand-knitted socks with notes saying, "Stay warm, love Mom," children's drawings of Christmas trees with "Missing you, Daddy," scrawled in crayon, a harmonica with a note, "For when you need to remember home." Every package, a small universe of love and connection, a reminder that American soldiers weren't just well supplied, they were cherished, remembered, connected to a home front that had capacity for both industrial production and human affection. Berg held a pair of wool mittens that someone's grandmother had knitted, each finger crafted with careful attention, and felt his ideological certainty crumble like frozen earth. The Americans weren't weak. They were so strong they could afford gentleness. They could fight a global war while maintaining the small kindnesses that made life worth living. The Third Reich, in its pursuit of thousand-year glory, had forgotten that people fought for next Christmas, not next millennium. "Distribute them," he told his men quietly. "The packages. Give them out." "But Unterscharführer, these are enemy supplies." "They're Christmas presents," Berg interrupted, his voice hollow. "From mothers to sons, give them out." The SS soldiers, the elite of National Socialist ideology, spent Christmas Eve, 1944, eating cookies baked in Iowa kitchens, wearing socks knitted in Vermont, reading Christmas cards meant for American boys they might kill tomorrow. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. They were supermen consuming the care packages of their supposed inferiors, finding in them a humanity their own system had systematically destroyed. On Christmas morning, Oberleutnant Friedrich Zimmermann attended a field briefing, where a propaganda officer attempted to maintain morale with news of wonder weapons, of jet fighters that would sweep American bombers from the sky, of rockets that would bring Britain to its knees. The assembled officers listened in silence, their pockets full of American cigarettes, their stomachs digesting American rations. When the propaganda officer finished, a Hauptmann from the 9th Panzer Division raised his hand. "Herr Major," he said quietly. "With respect, I've seen American supply drops that are larger than our ammunition deliveries. They drop more chocolate than we drop bombs. How exactly will these wonder weapons overcome that?" The propaganda officer had no answer. There was no answer. The wonder weapons were real, the Me-262 jet fighter, the V-2 rocket, but they were drops of water against an ocean of American industrial might. Germany could produce marvels of engineering in small numbers. America could produce adequacy in infinite quantities. In total war, adequacy in abundance defeated excellence in scarcity every time. As December 26th dawned, and the American counteroffensive began to push German forces back, Hartmann's squad found themselves in full retreat. Their advance's high water mark measured as much in consumed K-rations as captured territory. They passed through villages where weeks before German civilians had cheered their advance. Now those same civilians begged not for liberation but for American food the soldiers had hoarded. An old woman approached Hartmann, her grandson's hand clutched in her gnarled fingers. The boy, perhaps 6 years old, stared at the chocolate bar protruding from Hartmann's pocket with an intensity that belonged to no childhood. "Please," she whispered. "For the boy. For Christmas." Hartmann gave them the chocolate, then his remaining K-rations, then watched his entire squad empty their pockets for the gathering crowd of hungry Germans. They were conquering heroes reduced to relief workers, distributing American abundance to their own starving people. The irony was so perfect it transcended tragedy and entered the realm of absurdist comedy. The retreat from the Ardennes became a meditation on abundance and absence. By January 15, 1945, as German forces fell back to their starting positions, Feldwebel Klaus Hartmann's squad had been reduced to 5 men from the original 12. But it wasn't American bullets that had done the most damage. 3 had deserted, walking into captivity with empty stomachs and full knowledge of what awaited them. Another had been transferred after refusing to destroy captured American supplies, arguing that it was a crime against humanity to waste what could feed the hungry. The phrase would have been laughable in its naivety just months earlier. Now it carried the weight of moral truth that no amount of Nazi ideology could counterbalance. The Western Front's collapse accelerated through February and March, but the conversations in German bunkers had shifted permanently. Soldiers no longer spoke of wonder weapons or final victory. Instead, they traded recipes they'd learned from K-ration boxes, discussed rumors of American POW camps where prisoners gained weight, and wondered aloud which variety of American cigarette they'd smoke when this was over. The subjunctive had changed, not if we lose, but when we surrender, and not whether to surrender, but how to survive until we can. Hartmann encountered the final proof of Germany's conceptual defeat in early April 1945, just days before his own capture. His depleted unit had been assigned to defend a supply depot near Hamelin, one of the Wehrmacht's last functioning logistics centers in western Germany. When he arrived, he found the depot commander, Oberst Müller, drunk on schnapps and laughing with the bitter mirth of complete understanding. "Come, Feldwebel," Müller slurred, gesturing at the depot's contents. "Come see what we're defending." The warehouse contained Germany's final reserve supplies for the Western Front. Hartmann walked through aisles of ersatz coffee, black bread that would last weeks because it contained more preservative than grain, tins of meat that was mostly turnip and sawdust, and ammunition for weapons that no longer existed in meaningful numbers. At the center of it all, like a shrine to impossibility, sat the pride of German military logistics, a crate of special rations, meant for frontline troops enduring the heaviest combat. Each special ration contained an extra 50 grams of bread, a small tin of artificial jam, and 2 cigarettes of Turkish tobacco mixed with dried beech leaves. "This is what Berlin thinks will motivate men to die for the Reich." Müller laughed, tears streaming down his face. 50 grams of sawdust bread and fake cigarettes. The Americans throw away more than this after breakfast. 3 days later, when American tanks rolled into Hamelin, they found the depot intact, Oberst Müller having refused to destroy it. "Let German civilians eat it after you're gone," he told the American captain, accepting his surrender. "God knows it's all they'll have." The American officer, confused by the emotional intensity over what appeared to be worthless supplies, ordered K-rations distributed to the German prisoners. Müller wept openly as he ate, dignity abandoned in the face of processed cheese and crackers that contained no sawdust. The surrender ceremonies of May 1945 carried their own food-related ironies. At Reims, where Generaloberst Alfred Jodl signed the first instrument of surrender, American officers offered coffee and sandwiches to the German delegation. Real coffee, white bread sandwiches with actual meat. Jodl's aide, accustomed to the deprivations of Berlin's final days, ate with mechanical determination while negotiating the terms of unconditional surrender, as if trying to consume enough calories to sustain the entire German general staff through whatever came next. But it was in the prisoner of war camps that the full psychological transformation reached its conclusion. Hartmann, captured on April 12, 1945, found himself in a temporary POW camp near Mannheim with thousands of other Wehrmacht soldiers. The first meal served was hot soup, not the watery Wehrmacht variety, but thick with vegetables and chunks of beef. The German soldiers ate in stunned silence, many crying into their bowls, overwhelmed by the cognitive dissonance of enemy imprisonment, providing better nutrition than friendly service ever had. Within days, a black market economy emerged in the camp, but it ran in reverse of every economic principle the Germans knew. Prisoners traded war souvenirs, iron crosses, Wehrmacht daggers, unit patches, not for extra food but for writing materials, to send letters home describing the impossible. They were eating better as prisoners than they had as soldiers. They needed to tell their families not to worry, that surrender meant survival, that the Americans were feeding them with the same casual abundance they'd glimpsed in those K-rations months earlier. A captured Wehrmacht colonel, maintaining military bearing even in defeat, asked an American guard why they fed their prisoners so well. The guard, a 19-year-old from Nebraska, shrugged and replied, "Why wouldn't we? It's just food." That shrug, that casual dismissal of what Germans had killed and died for, contained within it the entire architecture of American victory. It wasn't just food. It was industrial capacity so vast that feeding defeated enemies was a negligible expense. It was agricultural production so abundant that surplus was a bigger problem than scarcity. It was a society so confident in its resources that generosity cost nothing. The letters home from German POWs became documents of transformation. Hartmann wrote to his wife in June 1945, "I am ashamed to tell you that I have gained 5 kilograms while you starve. They feed us 3 times a day. Meat, vegetables, bread that is actually bread. The Americans complain that it's monotonous. I wanted to laugh but found myself crying instead. We started a war against a nation that considers abundance boring. How did we ever think we could win?" By the time Hartmann was released in 1946, he had gained 12 kilograms and lost all capacity for the nationalism that had once defined him. He returned to a destroyed Germany, where his family was surviving on 1,200 calories a day under British rationing, where his children didn't recognize him not because of the time past, but because he looked healthier than anyone they'd seen in years. He carried with him chocolate bars and cigarettes from his final Red Cross package, treasures from captivity that exceeded anything German freedom could provide. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, would eventually pump billions of dollars of aid into Germany, including food supplies that would finally end the hunger years. But for men like Hartmann, who had tasted American abundance amid German scarcity, the psychological reconstruction had already occurred. They had learned, through their stomachs, through K-rations scattered across frozen battlefields, through POW meals that exceeded pre-war German standards, that they had challenged a giant they never truly understood. The real revelation wasn't American military might. Wehrmacht officers had always respected that, even while believing German tactical superiority could overcome it. The revelation was that American soldiers could afford to be wasteful because waste itself was a luxury their society had achieved. When you could throw away food, you had already won a victory that transcended battlefields. In 1950, Hartmann took his family to see a new American film at a rebuilt cinema in Cologne. Halfway through, a scene showed American soldiers complaining about K-rations, tossing them aside in disgust, demanding better food. The German audience laughed, not bitter laughter, but knowing laughter, the shared understanding of people who had learned history's lesson through the most basic human need. The Americans on screen were complaining about food that had seemed miraculous to starving German soldiers, and that gap, that impossible, unbridgeable gap between perception and reality, had been the truest measurement of defeat. Hartmann's son, born after the war, asked him on the way home what was so funny about soldiers not liking their food. Hartmann thought of frozen foxholes in the Ardennes, of chocolate bars and processed cheese, of a war lost not in grand battles, but in the quiet arithmetic of industrial abundance. They could afford not to like it, he told his son. That was how we knew the war was over before it ended. They could afford not to like what we would have died to possess. The boy didn't understand, couldn't understand, raised in a rebuilding Germany where American aid was reconstituting possibility. But Hartmann understood, would always understand, that wars are won not by those who fight hardest, but by those who can fight while barely trying, who can maintain such surplus that their garbage exceeds their enemies' treasures. The K-ration, maligned, mocked, and discarded by its intended consumers, had been the most honest messenger of American power, more truthful than any propaganda, more convincing than any weapon. In the end, Germany hadn't been defeated by American armies. It had been defeated by American abundance, by the terrible knowledge that while German soldiers counted every calorie, American soldiers could afford to throw food away. That carelessness, that magnificent waste, had been the ultimate expression of power, not the ability to destroy, but the capacity to discard, not the will to dominate, but the option to be indifferent. The Third Reich had promised a 1,000-year empire built on will and racial superiority. It had lasted 12 years and been undone by chocolate bars and processed cheese, by the simple, devastating fact that American soldiers could throw away what German soldiers would treasure. In the architecture of that defeat lay the blueprint for a new world order, one measured not in conquest, but in consumption, not in ideology, but in industrial capacity, not in racial mythology, but in the democratic distribution of abundance. The war had ended not with a bang, but with a wrapper, crumpled and discarded, more eloquent in its casual waste than any speech or surrender document could ever be.